everybody. Today's tips from a therapist's office, we're going to talk about isolation. But we're not going to talk about isolation as a behavior or an experience so much as we're going to talk about the subtle ways that isolation can set in. So over the course of the last year and a half, we have all been in some form of quarantine, fear, stress, the shared cumulative experience of what's been going on. And for many people, there's been a slow burn into isolation as a result of that. But the pandemic and a quarantine are not the only thing that can create a slow move into isolation that eventually we realize when we're in it. It can be anything that involves what we call toxic stress, meaning the kind of stress that shifts into an unhealthy space. There is a window of tolerance for stress that many of us operate in or can operate in that can be considered a space of growth for some people. But stress shifts into toxicity at a certain point when simply being under stress or being uncomfortable is no longer a reasonable or acceptable goal. And when we're experiencing toxic stress, it is much more likely that we will start to move into isolation because we won't think that we can do things or have people or participate in things other than the stressful thing. So the quarantine gave us a very glaring example of that, where people couldn't do things and couldn't engage in the things that they love and care about. So the isolation set in fast and the emotional experience stretched and burned into toxicity eventually. So that toxic space that became what I'm calling a subtle isolation led to a lot of transactional exchanges. Just you do this for me, I do this for you, and that's it. You drop people delivering food, you're ordering things in, you're not able to engage in the safe, meaningful, connective communication that we need to thrive. And then we became isolated by force and had to kind of maintain isolation to just manage being in a quarantine. So many of us had to turn to probably difficult, destructive, or even what might be considered unproductive coping behaviors as a way to manage the isolation. Many of those behaviors would have been things that allowed us to pass large chunks of time quickly. This is where we can slip into an addictive behavior, disordered eating, or generally distance ourselves from healthy behaviors because we don't know how to access them anymore. And once we didn't know how to access a healthy behavior, isolation is right on the other side of that. So isolation here is also an emotional experience. It's not just a physical isolation, which is the obvious part, but it's the emotional isolation of missing people, missing communication, missing connection. So the way to start to reemerge or to manage isolation, if you feel you've been getting isolated or even you're prone to patterns of isolation, is to find where are your safest, most authentic spaces? Where do you feel you are you? Where do you have your strongest sense of self? It could be with an individual. It could be with certain people. It could also be just doing something you care about, being creative, reading, moving your body. These are all healthy things that even if you do them alone, but you know they matter to you, it reduces your sense of isolation. Because isolation can set in slowly and it can feel somewhat forced when we start to reflect on it. But in most of the examples of how we manage isolation, it's not a matter of you have to be around a lot of people. Not everybody is comfortable around a lot of people. The way that we manage isolation is we see how we can reconnect to our most authentic self and take up our most authentic space. However you do that is yours, and you own that, and you deserve it. And if you don't know how to find that or what that is, there's a lot of people out here like myself that are interested in helping so that you don't have to slip into a pattern of isolation that becomes destructive. You can have a pattern that allows you to feel into maybe the difficulty of isolation and then shift into a space of safety.